My husband confessed something utterly unexpected and disheartening. He admitted that he's physically attracted to my best friend, who is not only married but someone I've known and cherished nearly all my life. The way this unfolded was as humiliating as it was painful, and I made the decision to let him experience the consequences of his own honesty, unfiltered and raw. To understand the gravity of this, here's a little context. The three of us, my husband Jacob, my best friend Nicole, and I, were all classmates back in high school. While Jacob wasn't particularly close with either of us back then, Nicole and I were inseparable. She and I have weathered everything together: heartbreaks, triumphs, terrible haircuts, and life transitions. We've remained rock solid through it all. Jacob and I, on the other hand, were just acquaintances in high school. He didn't really hang out with our group. We reconnected years later at a high school reunion that Nicole unfortunately missed because she was feeling under the weather. At the event, Jacob and I struck up a conversation. What started as casual banter turned into something more when he asked me out a couple of times after that. As we got to know each other better, we found out that we had more in common than either of us had ever expected. Our bond grew quickly, and not long after, we found ourselves falling for each other. After 2 years of dating, Jacob and I tied the knot. That was 3 years ago. Our married life was for the most part happy. Nicole was always a big part of my life, and she had also found someone special, Travis, who she met at work. They dated for a few years and finally got married about a year ago. The four of us had gone out on several double dates. We'd share meals, exchange jokes, talk about everything from politics to personal dreams. Everything seemed so normal, so comfortable, so right. Then, last week happened. Jacob and I had both endured an exhausting week, full of deadlines and stress. To wind down and celebrate making it through, we stayed in, opened a bottle of wine, and ended up finishing the whole thing. Slightly tipsy and feeling giddy, we decided to play a lighthearted game we'd played once before, listing 5 celebrities we'd be allowed to hook up with. No hard feelings. You know, just fantasy stuff. I had my list ready. 5 big-name celebrities. Jacob rattled off 4 and then stalled. I teased him about not being able to come up with a 5th name. It was supposed to be silly fun, a harmless competition between 2 tipsy spouses. But then he blurted out something that instantly soured the entire atmosphere. He said that if he could add one more name to his list, he'd choose Nicole. Yes, my best friend Nicole. The moment the words left his mouth, I froze. At first, I tried to laugh it off because he seemed to be chuckling too, but even in my drunken haze, I couldn't find anything amusing about what he had just said. It didn't feel like a joke. Something in his tone, or maybe the casual confidence with which he said it, unsettled me deeply. I pressed him about it, asking if he was being serious, and reminded him that the game was supposed to be about celebrities people were never going to actually meet, let alone hook up with. Naming someone real, especially someone close, crossed a line. Instead of backing down or realizing how inappropriate that was, he doubled down. He confessed that he had always had a thing for Nicole, even way back in high school. He even added, quite callously, that he used to see me as Nicole's less attractive sidekick. I sat there, stunned, my mouth hanging open. My husband, the man I married, who I trusted with everything, was telling me all of this with a straight face, as if it were no big deal. And he didn't stop there. He went on to say how incredible it would be to spend just one day with someone like Nicole, and how lucky Travis must be to have her as his wife. At that point, I couldn't take it anymore. I quietly got up and walked to the bedroom, not trusting myself to respond. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I just left. I was beyond upset, but I was also extremely drunk, and sleep claimed me quickly. When I woke up the next morning, unfortunately, none of it had disappeared into the fog of memory. I remembered every single word. Despite my pounding headache, I confronted Jacob over breakfast. There he sat, calmly eating cereal, as if he hadn't dropped a nuclear bomb on our relationship the night before. I asked him if he had really meant what he said. Without blinking, he told me that every word had been true. He wasn't even embarrassed. There wasn't a shred of remorse on his face. His nonchalance made my blood boil. This was my husband, the man I had chosen over everyone else, openly admitting that he still found my best friend more attractive than me, and he didn't even care how that might make me feel. So I asked the question that had been gnawing at me all night. Did he still find Nicole attractive? Without hesitation, he answered yes. That was the tipping point. I couldn't stay composed anymore. I exploded, telling him just how hurtful and insulting his words had been. But instead of apologizing, he dismissed my feelings. He said I needed to grow up and accept the truth. He claimed that while he loved me deeply and believed I was his soulmate, Nicole was objectively more attractive, and if the choice were based solely on physical appearance, he'd choose her every time. According to him, that wasn't something I should take personally, it was just honesty. The audacity of that statement broke something inside me. When I lashed out, he accused me of being petty and overly sensitive. Before heading out to work, he said he wasn't going to lie to protect my feelings, and that if I couldn't handle the truth, I shouldn't have pushed the game the night before. Apparently, teasing him over not having a fifth celebrity name justified him confessing his attraction to my best friend. As if the entire situation was somehow my fault. He twisted the situation so skillfully, trying to make it seem like I had orchestrated the entire mess by daring to ask a silly, tipsy question. But his response hadn't been silly. It hadn't even been remotely acceptable. There's a line between playful honesty and cruel, unnecessary truth, and Jacob had obliterated that line without a second thought. What really stung wasn't just the fact that he found someone else attractive. It was that he chose her. Nicole, the one person he knew was central to my life, my past, and my sense of stability. It's one thing to be attracted to a stranger or a celebrity, someone distant and unreachable. But Nicole, she's not just real, she's close, she's kind, and she's practically family. Knowing that my husband had been secretly harboring feelings for her for years made my stomach turn. He didn't seem to realize, or maybe he didn't care, that in confessing all this, he was tearing apart the foundation of our marriage. What kind of trust could remain when he saw me as second best, and not just to anyone, but to the woman who's been part of my story since I was 5 years old? There's a betrayal in that which cuts deeper than words can convey. I kept thinking back to our past double dates. All those laughs, the shared stories, the casual photos we took together, every memory now felt tainted. Was he sitting across from her at those dinners, imagining things he should never have allowed himself to think about? Was he pretending all along, smiling politely while secretly wishing he were with her instead of me? My mind spiraled into a storm of doubt and self-loathing. I started wondering if he'd ever really seen me for who I am, or if he had always measured me against Nicole. Had he only married me because she wasn't available? Had I always just been the consolation prize in his eyes? These were questions I never wanted to ask, but now I couldn't escape them. And it wasn't just about physical attraction. The way he spoke, the things he admitted, there was a clear undercurrent of comparison. He didn't just find Nicole beautiful. He seemed to admire her entirely, as if she were some perfect ideal he could never attain. And in doing so, he reduced me to someone he settled for. That realization shook me to my core. That morning, as I sat across from him in silence, watching him eat his cereal like nothing was wrong, I realized something important. His honesty wasn't brave, it was cruel. He wasn't being transparent for the sake of our relationship. He was being selfish, indulging in a fantasy that had no place in a committed partnership. And when confronted, instead of reflecting on his hurtful words, he turned it all back on me. I wasn't just disappointed, I was devastated. How do you continue living with someone who so clearly doesn't respect your place in their life? And more importantly, how do you protect your own self-worth when the person you love most tells you that you come second to someone you've always considered your closest friend? That day, something shifted in me. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to sweep this under the rug. Jacob might have been comfortable pretending his truth was no big deal, but I couldn't unhear what he said. I couldn't go back to pretending everything was fine. His actions had consequences, and whether he realized it or not, the damage was already done. That morning, I didn't go to work. I couldn't. My emotions were far too raw, too unsettled. I spent the day at home, completely unraveling. Tears kept welling up out of nowhere. One moment, I was staring blankly at the wall, trying to hold it together. The next, I was sobbing into a crumpled tissue. I had never felt so betrayed, so humiliated, so hopelessly alone. Normally, I'd talk things out with my husband or my best friend, but now, because of what happened, I couldn't confide in either of them. The silence of that day was unbearable. When Jacob returned home that evening, we didn't speak. The silence between us was suffocating, like a storm cloud permanently stationed above our heads. That silence persisted, not just through the night, but for the next 2 days. He carried on as though nothing was wrong. He genuinely believed he hadn't done anything wrong. According to him, he was just being honest. That was his justification. Honesty, without empathy or boundaries, became his shield. By the 3rd day, I reached my limit. I couldn't carry the weight of it anymore. Nicole had been texting and calling, checking in because she knew something was off. She could sense it in my voice, in the way I replied to messages. Normally, I was warm, chatty, always the first to send memes or ask how her day was. But that week, I had become a shadow. She kept pressing gently, concerned, and finally, I broke. I told her everything, every word Jacob had said, every brutal truth he'd unleashed over cereal and wine. She was furious, absolutely livid. The moment she processed what I was saying, she wanted to pick up her phone and call Jacob immediately. She said she was going to tell him off and make sure he understood exactly how disrespectful and vile he had been. But I stopped her. I wasn't ready. I hadn't figured out what to do yet. I didn't want her to confront him, not yet. Nicole was quiet for a beat, then resolute. "You can't let him get away with this," she told me. "He needs to face real consequences. He doesn't respect you, and honestly, you shouldn't stay married to someone who sees you that way." I knew she was right. Deep down, I had known it since the moment he chose to stand by his words rather than apologize. But knowing what's right and knowing what to do, they aren't always the same thing. I didn't want to walk away without at least one moment of vindication. I wanted Jacob to understand the gravity of what he'd done. I wanted him to be humbled. Nicole mentioned offhandedly that if Jacob had said that nonsense in front of her husband, Travis, the outcome would have been memorable. Travis, after all, once beat up a guy for catcalling Nicole on the street. Can you imagine if he'd said this in front of Travis, she joked. That gave me an idea, a risky, bold, reckless idea. What if he does, I asked. What if we make him? I proposed a double date. Nicole and Travis would join Jacob and me at a nice restaurant. I'd steer the conversation toward that game we'd played, the one that started all this. I'd let Jacob walk right into it, encouraged by a little well-placed lie. He wouldn't see it coming. Nicole was immediately on board. We even laughed, trying to picture the look on Jacob's face when he realized the setup. My pain had transformed into something sharper, anger laced with a desire for poetic justice, to set the trap. I approached Jacob later that evening and apologized. I told him I was sorry for overreacting, that I had been emotional and unfair. I cooked him his favorite meal, put on a smile, and told him I wanted to go out on a double date with Nicole and Travis. He accepted without hesitation, and to my absolute disgust, he said, "I'm glad you finally came to your senses." But I wasn't done yet. The day before the dinner, I added one final touch. I told Jacob that Nicole had once admitted to having a crush on him, and that she'd be open to going out with him if it ever became an option. I told him Travis wouldn't mind, it was just a date after all. His eyes lit up, he was practically giddy. I watched his face shift from surprise to elation, and while part of me felt a flicker of guilt, it was quickly extinguished by the memory of his smug confession. On the night of the dinner, we went all out. Nicole and I chose one of the most upscale restaurants in town. We dressed to the nines. It was a warm evening, and the city lights shimmered across the skyline. On the surface, it looked like a perfect outing, two happy couples sharing wine and conversation. But underneath, Nicole and I were bracing for the explosion. Dinner started with casual chit-chat. Wine flowed, laughter echoed. Jacob, in his element, clearly thought the hard part was behind us. After a while, I gently nudged the conversation toward familiar territory. "Remember that game we played the other night?" I asked, swirling my wine, the 5 celebrities list. Jacob grinned. The trap was set. I named 5 well-known celebrities just like before. Then I turned to Jacob and invited him to share his list. He didn't hesitate. He beamed and looked right at Nicole. "I'd choose Nicole," he said, with an air of boldness. The table fell silent. Nicole feigned shock flawlessly. Her eyes widened and she leaned back as if caught off guard. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. I mirrored her reaction, gasping slightly, turning to Jacob with mock surprise. Then I glanced at Travis. He was already clenching his jaw. His muscles were tense, eyes narrowed, face flushed with anger. You could feel the air grow heavier. Travis leaned forward and told Jacob calmly, "You're going to apologize right now, to everyone here, and then this dinner ends." It was Jacob's chance, the one sliver of redemption, a moment to acknowledge he'd overstepped, apologize, and salvage a fragment of dignity. But of course, Jacob did the exact opposite. With arrogance etched into his face, he smiled and said, "Why would I apologize? I know Nicole feels the same. We're just being honest, right?" Travis's expression darkened. Nicole recoiled in disbelief. The entire table became a powder keg, and Jacob still didn't see it. He doubled down, believing the lies I had fed him. In his mind, this was his moment of triumph, a mutual confession between two people who'd harbored secret feelings. But it wasn't real. It had never been real, and he had just declared it in front of Nicole's husband. What happened next was the fallout neither of us will ever forget. The tension was unbearable, and the temperature in the room felt like it had spiked by 10 degrees. Jacob, still blissfully unaware of the consequences looming, sat back in his chair, his arms crossed with smug satisfaction. He looked from Nicole to Travis, as if expecting them to break into laughter or nod in agreement. Nicole leaned forward, her voice cutting like glass. "You really thought I'd say that I'd be okay with you disrespecting your wife, my best friend, and embarrassing me in public?" Jacob's smile faltered. For the first time, doubt crept into his eyes. Travis stood up slowly, the scrape of the chair legs dragging across the floor like a warning bell. His jaw was set, and every muscle in his body was taut with restrained fury. "You've got 5 seconds to apologize," he said, voice low and steady, "or this night's going to end differently than you expect." Jacob's cocky demeanor began to crack. His eyes darted between us, looking for a sign that this was still part of some elaborate joke. But there was no laughter, no forgiveness in our expressions, only anger and betrayal. Nicole folded her arms, glaring. "She trusted you, and you turned around and told her she was second best." The spell was broken. The illusion Jacob had wrapped himself in, built on lies and delusions, was torn apart in front of him. There was no flirtation, no secret desire, just two furious women and one husband ready to defend his wife's honor. Jacob's mouth opened, then closed. He looked like he might apologize, but the moment had passed. Travis moved toward him, and that was enough. Jacob scrambled out of his seat, muttering something incoherent, eyes wide. He fumbled to collect his things and hurried toward the exit, his bravado shattered. The restaurant was silent for a few long moments. Then Nicole turned to me, touched my hand gently, and said, "You did good." And for the first time in days I felt a flicker of peace. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I went home, took off my heels, and poured myself a glass of wine. I had stood up for myself. I had turned my pain into power. And even though there was more heartbreak to come, I knew one thing clearly. I would never let someone like Jacob make me feel small again. The moment Jacob said those words, as if he and Nicole had now been freed to explore their supposed mutual attraction without judgment, something inside Travis snapped. He didn't even hesitate. With a burst of fury, Travis reached across the table, grabbed Jacob by the collar, and yanked him to his feet with such force that the entire table rattled. Before anyone could react, there was a sharp, sickening thud. Jacob went down hard, his body crashing against the wooden floor of the restaurant. Everything was chaos after that. I vaguely remember gasps from surrounding diners and staff rushing over. Nicole and I were too stunned to speak. There was blood, too much of it. The restaurant management moved quickly to avoid a scandal. They didn't want police involvement, probably fearing the headlines, so they escorted all of us out without calling the cops. Outside, Jacob was clearly dazed. Blood streamed from his nose, which looked grotesquely crooked. He clutched at it with both hands, muttering curses through clenched teeth. But even with his face bloodied and bruised, he wasn't done. Instead of walking away, he turned toward Nicole and me, venom in his eyes. "You set me up," he hissed. "You two cowardly snakes." That's when it hit him. He realized this entire evening had been orchestrated, that Nicole and I had planned it all. We hadn't hidden our satisfaction well enough. He saw it in our expressions, the silence, the lack of shock. He saw the trap for what it was. Jacob's anger surged again. He began shouting, flinging accusations, even trying to get closer to us as if to confront us physically. Travis, still standing guard, warned him sharply. "One more word," he said in a low, threatening tone. Nicole and Travis drove me to a nearby hotel since I didn't want to go back home. I wasn't even sure what home meant anymore. During the car ride, Travis remained mostly quiet until I explained everything. How this had been Nicole's and my plan, how we'd used that setup to confront Jacob, and that we had intentionally kept Travis out of the loop. To our surprise, Travis wasn't angry. "Good thing you didn't tell me," he said. "If I'd known ahead of time, I might have talked myself out of hitting him, but seeing it unfold the way it did, well, he had it coming." He made it clear that he didn't enjoy violence, but in this case, he wasn't sorry. After dropping me off at the hotel, they headed back home, planning to get a proper dinner after everything that had gone down. The restaurant fiasco had left all of us with nothing but adrenaline and half-finished drinks. I tried to settle in for the night, exhausted in every possible way, but just as I was about to fall asleep, my phone buzzed with a message from Jacob. "You're an awful person," he wrote. "I had to go to the ER by myself. My nose is broken, plastered, and I bled all over my clothes. All because you wanted to get back at me for saying your friend was attractive? That's sick. You're sick. I want a divorce." His text went on. He accused me of plotting like a psycho. He said I manipulated him into a violent situation, lied about Nicole's feelings, and then laughed when he got hurt. He called it juvenile, psychotic, disgusting. And for a moment I felt bad. I know Jacob has always hated hospitals. I know blood freaks him out. The idea of him wandering into the ER, still stunned, still bleeding, getting stitches or a cast without anyone by his side, it got to me. A part of me ached, not for the man he was, but for the vulnerability I had once cared about. But I didn't reply. I didn't know what to say. I was too emotionally drained and too wrapped up in my own whirlwind of thoughts, so I set my phone down and drifted into uneasy sleep. This morning, everything feels different. I'm no longer floating on the high of watching him get punched. I'm grounded again. and with that clarity comes a mix of regret and realization. He's right about some things. What Nicole and I did was petty, juvenile. We schemed like a pair of giddy teenagers, knowing full well that it would end in humiliation. We didn't think about the consequences. We didn't consider the emotional fallout, and worst of all, we used Travis as a pawn. We didn't think about how unfair it was to involve him without warning, to rely on his temper to make our point. That wasn't okay. Yes, Jacob said things that were cruel and demeaning. Yes, he disrespected me and violated the trust that forms the core of any marriage, but instead of walking away with dignity, I chose revenge, and that makes me complicit in this disaster. The memory of him calling me Nicole's less attractive sidekick still burns. I can't erase it. That kind of insult coming from someone who vowed to love and cherish me will always sting. And I don't forgive him for that. But I also can't ignore my own role in how far this spiraled. The marriage is clearly over. There's no going back from this. But I don't know if I owe him an apology. Maybe not for what he said, but for how I chose to respond. For setting a trap and watching him fall into it, knowing full well that it could lead to violence. This whole situation is a mess. Reading through comments and advice, I've come to see the truth. No one here is entirely innocent. Everyone sucks, in their own way. Jacob's words were toxic and disrespectful. My reaction, though satisfying in the moment, was impulsive and vindictive. And Nicole, while loyal to me, helped orchestrate something that bordered on manipulation. We didn't just hurt Jacob, we embarrassed him in public. We triggered a man we know struggles with controlling his anger. We made a mockery out of something deeply serious. And now, in the quiet aftermath, I'm ashamed of it all. What started as a plan for justice became something darker, an emotional ambush. It was cathartic, yes, but it was also cruel. We didn't give Jacob a chance to reflect or change. We gave him a stage and set him up to fall. And no matter how much I despised what he said, I can't pretend my actions were noble. I keep replaying that night. The way he smiled, so confident, thinking he was about to impress Nicole. The way his face crumbled when reality crashed down. The sound of Travis's voice low and serious, just before the punch landed. The blood. The silence that followed. It's a memory that will stay with me, not just for what it meant for Jacob, but for what it revealed about me. I wanted him to feel what I felt, to be humiliated, exposed, and hurt, and I succeeded. But in doing so, I also hurt myself. I crossed a line I didn't know I was capable of crossing. Now, I sit here in this hotel room, unsure of what to do next. I know Jacob wants a divorce, and maybe that's the only logical outcome at this point. There's no trust left, no foundation to rebuild from. But there's also a tiny part of me that wonders, maybe not. Maybe his words were a clear sign that our marriage was always going to break, but I can't help but question my role in its destruction. I wasn't just a victim, I became a participant in a cycle of hurt. So now, I'm trying to decide what kind of person I want to be moving forward. Do I want to be someone who lashes out when wronged? Someone who uses others to settle emotional scores? Or do I want to be better than that? Nicole has been quiet today too. I think she's also reflecting. We haven't spoken since last night. I think we're both feeling the weight of what we did, realizing that even when you feel justified, cruelty doesn't solve anything. It just leaves you empty. Jacob may have broken something between us with his words, but I broke something in myself with my actions. That's what hurts the most. It's been 3 days since everything happened, and Nicole and I have been sitting with the weight of it all. The adrenaline has worn off, the anger has dulled, and what remains is a sense of uncomfortable clarity. We now fully understand that, regardless of how justified our emotions may have felt, Jacob got physically hurt because of our setup, and that's not something we can just sweep under the rug. Neither of us condones violence, and while we didn't physically lay a hand on Jacob, we did create the environment where it became possible, and for that we owe him an apology. Not because he didn't deserve a wake-up call, but because we stooped low to deliver it. And while he hasn't pressed charges yet, the threat lingers. We can't ignore the possibility. So we've decided to apologize legally, but because it's the right thing to do. We're also apologizing to Travis. He's someone we put in a difficult position, exploiting his known struggle with anger issues. That was deeply unfair. Travis has worked hard to manage his temper. He's not some brute who lashes out without cause. He's been in therapy, trying to leave behind a reputation from his teen years. That incident with the guy who catcalled Nicole happened years ago, and it ended with nothing more than a black eye. Travis isn't someone who hits people unless seriously provoked, and what happened with Jacob had more to do with a buildup of disrespect than anything else. Still, it doesn't excuse us. We used Travis, knowingly placing him in a scenario that could have serious consequences. That's not loyalty. That's manipulation. So we went to Jacob's place. Nicole came with me, and the plan was simple. I'd collect my things from our home and deliver a heartfelt apology before leaving for good. Jacob opened the door, expression unreadable. He didn't say a word, he just stepped aside, letting us in. The silence was unbearable. As we packed, I noticed his bandaged nose and the bruises forming beneath his eyes. Guilt twisted in my stomach. He was clearly in pain, and for a brief moment I regretted everything. When I finally found the courage to speak, I told him I was sorry, not just for the plan, but for everything that had spiraled so out of control. I said I hadn't expected it to go that far, and that I had let my emotions dictate my actions. But Jacob didn't respond with grace. Instead, he told us our apologies meant nothing now that the damage was done. He said we should be grateful he hadn't pressed charges against Travis. Then, with a tone laced in contempt, he added something bizarre. He said both of us were lucky he'd even shown interest in us at all, because we were nothing compared to the women he'd dated before. We were stunned. Not angry, not indignant, just shocked. This wasn't just a man scorned. This was ego, wounded and dangerous, lashing out in its most desperate form. He ranted about how he had given us a chance and we had both blown it, as if Nicole and I had ever been competing for his affections. When I tried to explain that the apology wasn't about winning him back, he slammed the door in our faces. That moment, oddly enough, brought a sense of closure. We had done what we came to do. We took responsibility for our part in the chaos, and Jacob, well, he showed us who he really was one final time. He wasn't interested in peace. He wasn't even hurt about the betrayal. He was just angry that he had been made to look foolish, that his fantasy crumbled so publicly. Nicole and I walked away in silence, and for once, we didn't need to say anything to each other. We both understood. Later, our conversation with Travis went far better. He accepted our apology immediately, brushing it off as unnecessary. He said that if it had been any other man disrespecting his wife and her best friend like that, he would have done the same, no hesitation. He even joked that if Jacob's own parents hadn't taught him how to treat women, then someone had to step in. I could tell he meant it, but even then, it didn't erase the fact that we had pushed him into that situation. We told him so, admitting that we'd used his anger as a tool, and that was wrong. He appreciated our honesty. It didn't fix everything, but it helped. Now, with all of this behind us, I'm trying to move forward. I've booked a longer stay at the hotel and started making arrangements for the divorce. There's no part of me that doubts this is the right decision. My marriage wasn't just broken, it was built on illusions and silent competitions I never signed up for. Jacob saw me as less than, and no apology could fix that. Nicole and I are talking again, but we're both a little quieter now. The laughter isn't as loud, the plan's not so spontaneous. I think we both feel the weight of what happened, and it's going to take time before we fully move past it. But I'm not angry anymore. I'm not out for revenge. I don't want Jacob to suffer, I just want peace. Looking back, this all started with one stupid game and a single careless comment. But it spiraled because none of us took the time to sit down and speak honestly until it was too late. I wish I could go back and do it differently. Not because I want to save the marriage, but because I want to save myself from the guilt I now carry. Sometimes, it's not just about who was right and who was wrong. It's about learning when to walk away before things get ugly. It's about recognizing that even when someone hurts you, the way you respond defines your own character. I didn't make the best choices, but I'm going to learn from them, and that, I hope, will be enough. There's still a long road ahead. Paperwork, healing, untangling finances and memories. But I've made peace with the direction my life is taking. I no longer wake up wondering how Jacob feels or what he's thinking. That part of my life is done. And as for Nicole, our friendship has weathered one of its biggest storms. We've both acknowledged our mistakes and promised to do better, not just for each other, but for ourselves. We've learned the hard way that reacting with spite only drags us down. Sometimes people come into your life to teach you what love is supposed to look like, and sometimes they teach you exactly what it's not. Jacob was the latter. And while the scars from this chapter will take time to fade, I know I'll carry the lessons with me for the rest of my life. Because in the end, even the messiest endings can be the beginning of something far better. That was the end of it. No more drama, no more shouting matches, no unexpected twists. This storm had passed. With everything laid bare, the only thing left to do was move forward. I've started looking for a lawyer to help with the impending divorce, and while I don't fully know how I feel about any of it yet, I do know this much: I'll get through it. Having my friends and family by my side is the only reason I haven't completely fallen apart. Their support has been like scaffolding, keeping me upright while I try to rebuild. I know the legal process won't be easy. I'll still have to see Jacob a few more times before everything is finalized, and just the thought of that gives me a headache. But I'll deal with it. One meeting at a time, one signature after another. I can handle that. A few days ago, I officially filed for divorce. Jacob was served the papers yesterday, and this morning he sent me a text. It was brief but bitter. He told me I was going to regret this decision. But he also said he wasn't going to stop me, since I'd already made up my mind. Then came the real kicker. He told me to come back and pick up the rest of my stuff. All the small things I didn't take with me when I left. Photo albums, keepsakes, little trinkets from our trips, books, clothes. He said if I didn't collect them by the end of the week, he'd either donate them to charity or throw them in the trash. The message didn't sting the way I thought it might. If anything, it confirmed I was making the right choice. This wasn't someone who respected what we'd shared. This was someone trying to hurt me in petty, avoidable ways. I talked to Nicole, and she immediately offered to help. She's letting me stay with her for now and has cleared space in her storage room for all my things until I can find a place of my own. Honestly, I don't know what I would do without her. Jacob, meanwhile, has been doing what Jacob does best, talking behind my back. I've heard from mutual friends that he's spinning his own version of the story, but what he doesn't realize is that most people speak through it. He's the guy who hit on his wife's best friend and got punched in the face by her husband. No amount of revisionist storytelling can change that. The messages I've received from others have been overwhelmingly supportive. Friends I hadn't heard from in months reached out to tell me I'm doing the right thing, that they're proud of me, that they hope I find peace, and the truth is, I already have. Jacob's bitterness, his threats, his need to twist the story, none of it matters anymore. He's not my problem, not my burden, and not my future. I don't need to respond or defend myself. Because I've already won. I left with my dignity, and I'm never looking back.